The parallel Islamic sector. Uneven political liberalization under Sadat and Mubarak created a political system with a hollow core and a dynamic periphery. Although contestation for power in Egypt's formal political system remained tightly controlled from above, outside the sphere of party politics, there emerged a vast network of Islamic institutions with de facto autonomy from state control. During the 1980s and early 1990s, these ostensibly non-political institutions became important sites of Islamist outreach to educated youth. This political opening, thus inadvertently, gave rise to new kinds of political participation detached from and opposed to the country's formal political institutions and elites. Whether, when, and how an opposition movement comes to life depends on the opportunities and constraints that face would-be movement organizers and supporters in the general political environment. In recent years, scholars seeking to determine how broad environmental conditions shape a movement's trajectory have developed the concept of political opportunity structures. Although different definitions have been proposed, Doug McAdam observed that the concept tends to highlight four dimensions of the political environment. 1. The relative openness or closure of the institutionalized political system. 2. The stability or instability of the broad set of elite alignments typically undergirding a polity. 3. The presence or absence of elite allies. And 4. The state's capacity and propensity for repression. The political process model, an influential model of social movement formation in the United States, portrays expanding political opportunity structures as the ultimate trigger for the formation of movements. Based primarily on the study of movements in the democratic polities of Western Europe and the United States, this model focuses on expanding political opportunity structures within the formal political order. Yet, in authoritarian settings, in which opposition groups' access to formal political institutions and elites is typically restricted, we must also consider the space available to opposition actors in ostensibly non-political arenas less subject to state control. To this end, it is useful to distinguish among the center, defined as the national parliamentary arena in which legal political parties compete for power, the semi-periphery comprising the major occupational or professional interest groups, for example, labor unions, student unions, professional associations, and the periphery, encompassing all other potential arenas for collective action, including religious institutions, local, community, youth centers, schools, and even private households. As Garrison argued in the case of Chile under Pinochet, when regular party channels are blocked, other institutional arenas can become important sites of political contestation by default. The Egyptian case indicates that these substitute sites can also permit formally excluded opposition groups to reach out to the mass public. Indeed, an important finding is that even when opposition groups are denied access to the formal political order, ruling elites are unified, and the state's capacity for repression is high. An authoritarian regime may permit, or be unable to prevent, the emergence of autonomous zones in which mobilization is possible. This chapter explains how political and economic reform facilitated Islamic institution building on the periphery, and how the parallel Islamic sector that ensued created new space for Islamist outreach to urban, educated youth. While institutional growth on the periphery created a structural opening for mobilization, to understand its occurrence, we must address the question of agency. As I explain next, it was the conjuncture of expanding structures of opportunity on the periphery with the rise of a leadership cadre able to exploit them that paved the way for the Islamic mobilization of educated youth in Egypt in the 1980s and the early 1990s. The parallel Islamic sector. The phenomena. By the time Hosni Mubarak assumed power, a broad network of Islamic institutions had begun to coalesce in the interstices of Egypt's authoritarian state. These institutions had different functions, served different constituencies, and varied in geographic outreach. Yet despite their diversity, they can be thought of as forming a loose network given the ties of family, friendship, resource flows, and ideological commitments that bound them together. This network is referred to here as the parallel Islamic sector, that is, a sector largely independent of and competitive with the cultural, religious, and service-oriented arms of the Egyptian state. To understand how the parallel Islamic sector emerged, we must return to the 1970s when Islamic institution building in Egypt was aided by two crucial developments: the accession to power of a leader who sought to bolster his own Islamic legitimacy, and the regional oil boom that generated resources for community projects beyond state control. Because both these developments have been analyzed elsewhere, it should suffice to describe them only briefly here. The origins. All of Egypt's leaders since 1952 have been Muslims and have claimed to rule in a manner compatible with Islam. But while Nasser portrayed his goals as consistent with Islamic precepts, a convergence readily affirmed by clerics on the government payroll, Islam did not figure prominently in either the formation or the justification of his agenda. Instead, in keeping with the ideological themes in vogue throughout the Third World at the time, Nasser's rhetoric was secular, nationalist, and revolutionary in tone, emphasizing the struggle against Zionism and imperialism abroad, and against capitalist exploitation at home. By contrast, Islam was central to Anwar Sadat's self-image and claim to political authority. Styling himself the believer president, Sadat made a public show of his personal piety, promoted Islamic programming in the media, schools, and universities, expanded the government's support of official Islamic institutions, and used religious themes to justify the regime's policies, including the decision to go to war with Israel in 1973. As both a personal example and a patron of the Islamic establishment, Sadat encouraged the trend toward higher levels of religious observance in Egyptian society at large. In addition, he rehabilitated the Muslim Brotherhood, which had suffered years of oppression under Nasser. Brotherhood leaders were released from prison shortly after Sadat took office, and others were allowed to return to Egypt from exile. Though still technically illegal, the Brotherhood was permitted in 1976 to publish its own newspaper, a dawah, which enjoyed an estimated circulation of 100,000 before it was shut down in 1981. Sadat also encouraged the development of Islamic student associations, or Qanat, on university campuses, in the hope of developing an effective counterweight to the leftist groups that dominated student politics at the time. This tactical maneuver had unforeseen consequences, however, as the Qanat quickly evolved into vocal critics of Infitah and Sadat's rapprochement of the West. As the Islamist relationship with the regime grew more confrontational, Sadat shifted from accommodation to repression. But he ultimately failed to contain the forces he had unleashed. On October 6, 1981, Not long after ordering more arrests, Sadat himself was gunned down by Islamic militants. While the Brotherhood was reconstituting itself as a national political organization and Islamic groups were gaining ground on university campuses, a new wave of Islamic institution building began to reshape the landscape in Egyptian cities and towns. Economic liberalization facilitated this trend by expanding the private wealth available for investment in communal projects. Fueled by the regional oil boom, Egypt's GDP grew by an average of 9% per year in the decade between 1974 and 1984, more than doubling the per capita income from $334 to $700 by 1984. A major new source of capital was the remittances of Egyptian migrants working in Libya and the Gulf, who increased in number from about 10,000 in 1968 to 1.2 million in 1985. Much of this remittance income, officially valued at more than $3 billion annually in the early 1980s, found outlets beyond state control. Some of it was captured by the Islamic banks and investment companies that were established under the new investment laws of Infitah. Springboard, for example, estimates that between 1974 and 1984, about 1 million Egyptians invested in the Islamic investment companies. Another share of remittance income was invested in business ventures inside Egypt, including those headed by Egyptian businessmen with Islamist sympathies. In Who Owns Egypt, Samia Saeed Imam reported that as of the late 1980s, Egypt's private economy was effectively controlled by 18 families and their close associates. Brotherhood members accounted for 8. The study also calculated that Brotherhood interests might control more than 40% of all economic ventures, many of them centered on real estate and currency speculation. Under Mubarak, the parallel Islamic sector continued to grow in absolute size and complexity. Although its exact parameters are difficult to pin down, for example, there are no systematic data on the number of Islamic institutions in Mubarak's Egypt, let alone how they are disaggregated by size, function, or geographic location. Similarly, only sketchy information is available on the social background and orientations of their personnel, and the mechanisms through which they are financed. Finally, only anecdotal information exists on how these institutions relate to the state and to each other. Despite its limitations, however, it is possible to discern some general trends. The parallel Islamic sector in Mubarak's Egypt. For purposes of analysis, the institutions of the parallel Islamic sector can be divided into 3 general categories: private mosques, Islamic voluntary associations, including welfare societies, cultural organizations, health clinics, and schools, and Islamic for-profit commercial and business enterprises such as Islamic banks, investment companies, manufacturing firms, and publishing houses. These institutions are subject to different regulatory arrangements. Mosques officially fall under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Religious Endowments, Awqaf. Private voluntary associations are subject to Law 32 of 1964 and are administered by the Ministry of Social Affairs. And for-profit Islamic organizations are regulated by commercial and business legislation. Yet, as will be noted, the factors determining which laws apply to a particular type of Islamic institution in practice are even more complex. Egypt's private mosques. Among the most striking institutional developments in Egypt in the 1970s and 1980s was an unprecedented wave of private mosque building. Unlike government Hakumi mosques, which were maintained by state funds and staffed by government-appointed imams, private Ahli mosques were self-constituted organizations financed through private donations and staffed by imams selected by members of the local community. According to one estimate, the number of Ahli mosques increased from 20,000 in 1970 to more than 46,000 in 1981. Of those 46,000, only 6,000 were directly administered by the Ministry of Religious Endowments. A major source of financing for the new private mosques was the voluntary donations of private Egyptians collected through the system of zakat, the Islamic religious tithe. Private mosques also received financial support from institutional and individual patrons in the Gulf. The proliferation of new mosques was encouraged by legislation making any building containing a mosque a religious site and therefore tax exempt. With the domestic construction boom underway, builders had a clear incentive to establish new mosques, which often consisted of little more than a tiny prayer room, zawiya, located on the ground floor or in the basement. Private mosque building continued under Mubarak. According to the Minister of Religious Endowments, Dr. Muhammad Ali Maghoub, there were 91,000 mosques in Egypt in 1991, including 45,000 private mosques and 10,000 zawiyas. In December 1992, the Egyptian journal Akhir Sa'ah set the number of private mosques at 60,000. Other estimates were even higher. For example, the internal human rights organization Middle East Watch estimated that as of 1993, there were 170,000 mosques in Egypt, of which only 30,000 were operated by the government. In addition to hosting daily and Friday noon prayers, private mosques were often provided a wide variety of religious and community services. Some mosques sponsored religious lessons, durus dinya, for both sexes, after-school and daycare programs for young children, and competitions for reading the Quran and Hadith in celebration of Islamic holy days. Others served as the nuclei for a network of satellite institutions which might include a health clinic, kindergarten, charity distribution center, and a bookstore or lending library for Islamic books and cassette tapes. Particularly in low-income neighborhoods on the periphery of Cairo, where government services were scarce and networks of communal self-help were undeveloped, the local mosque and its satellite institutions often became the focal point of communal social life. Not only did they loom large as service providers, but they also were one of the few socially sanctioned arenas where young men and women could congregate outside the home. Islamic voluntary associations. In addition to private mosques, the parallel Islamic sector included thousands of quasi-independent Islamic voluntary associations, or Jama'at. The growth in the number of Islamic voluntary organizations can be seen as part of the broader proliferation of non-governmental organizations in Egypt during the Mubarak era. The term NGO is misleading, however, because in Egypt, such organizations are subject to state control. According to Law 32 of 1964, a holdover from the Nasser era, all private and civic associations in Egypt are administered by the Ministry of Social Affairs. Law 32 stipulates that all prospective associations must apply to this MSA for a license, which it has the authority to grant or withhold. In addition, the MSA can intervene in the functioning of existing associations. For example, it can appoint members of an association's board, demand written reports on its activities, and supervise the collection of funds and their uses. Moreover, it has the right to dissolve the association and seize its assets on rather elastic grounds. For instance, if its activities defy the general order and proper behavior. النظام العام والأدب. The total number of private voluntary organizations, PVOs, in Egypt in the early 1990s is often estimated at about 14,000 to 15,000, although some estimates reach as high as 30,000. Writing in 1992, Sarah Ben Nafisa, Paris, claimed that these numbers were exaggerated. Adding up the total of registered associations, she arrived at a total of 11,360, 26% of which were Islamic in character. According to Ben Nafisa Paris, there were slightly more than 3,000 Islamic private voluntary associations in Egypt in the early 1990s. Yet, this figure may actually underestimate the phenomenon. For 1994, Saad ad-Din Ibrahim claimed that 8,000 of a total 14,000 Egyptian private voluntary organizations were Islamic in character. Whatever their numbers, by the 1980s, Islamic voluntary associations had gained a central role in Egyptian public life. Some Islamic PVOs retained a traditional religious focus, such as the promoting memorization of the Quran, helping Muslims perform the pilgrimage, providing charity to needy families, and aiding in the renovation and beautification of local mosques. Others provided social services. The service-oriented POVs included Islamic health clinics, daycare centers, schools, and job training centers. In some areas, the PVO's activities were limited to a single neighborhood or local area. Other PVOs were well-financed national organizations with branches in many cities and towns. Among the most prominent of the national Islamic organizations was الجمعية الشرعية, with branches in all 26 governorates and 123 branches in Cairo alone. Although the information about financial flows in the Islamic sector remains largely anecdotal, certain trends are evident. Many Islamic voluntary associations operated under the aegis of a mosque or religious foundation, giving them access to charitable donations collected and distributed through networks away from government supervision. Access to such donations enabled Islamic PVOs to circumvent provisions of Law 32, restricting the independent collection of funds, giving them an enormous advantage over their non-Islamic counterparts. Some Islamic associations also received support from wealthy patrons in the Gulf. For example, the modern hospital attached to the Mustafa Mahmoud Society in Cairo was allegedly built with funds that came from a benefactor in the Gulf with close ties to the society's founder. Similarly, an Egyptian scholar who was studying financial flows to Islamic PVOs mentioned a private mosque in Zaytun, whose sheikh visited Saudi Arabia every year shortly before the pilgrimage season. He made the rounds of wealthy Saudi families, giving lectures and asking for donations, and returned to Egypt with millions of pounds to build a modern hospital attached to the mosque. Islamic associations also received financial support from Islamic investment companies and banks, as well as from parastatal banks that helped collect and distribute zakat. For example, Ben Nafisa Paris noted that with the aid of 4,500 committees to collect zakat, the Nasser Social Service Bank collected and distributed nearly 21 million pounds in 1991 to Islamic service organizations, including daycare centers and health clinics. In addition to cultivating a reputation for philanthropic activity, the bank had all funds directed toward zakat deducted from its tax base. Islamic associations were also funded by their own profit-making activities. This was the case for many of the country's Islamic health clinics and hospitals, which, in contrast to government clinics, were generally clean, well-run operations with up-to-date medical equipment. Subsidized by monetary gifts and donated materials, the clinics also charged a modest fee for their services. In some instances, the fees generated enough profit to subsidize other religious activities and services. The parallel Islamic sector also included profit-making enterprises in banking, construction, manufacturing, and trade. The Islamic financial sector for Islamic banks, which according to Islamic law do not charge interest, and Islamic investment companies. According to one estimate, in the mid-1980s, the total assets of the latter were 16 billion Egyptian pounds. Likewise, the sector included large Islamic manufacturing conglomerates, like Rayyan and Saad, with investments in such strategic areas as food production and housing construction, and with close ties to government officials. Such firms were well placed to provide financial and logistical support to Islamic service associations in daily contact with the mass public. Islamic firms also became active in cultural production. Islamic publishing houses and bookstores flourished in the 1980s and early 1990s. Concentrated in Egypt's large cities, such Islamic publishing houses as Dar al-Islami, للتوزيع والنشر, Dar al-Shuruk, Dar al-Wafa, and Dar al-I'tisam published a wide variety of Islamic literature, including commentaries on the Quran and Hadith, volumes on particular aspects of Islamic belief and practice, histories of Islamic movement in Egypt and abroad, and the speeches and essays of prominent Islamic thinkers, and small books and pamphlets on the Dawah, or call to Islam. In Cairo, these works were available for purchase in large central bookstores owned by the publishers and smaller Islamic bookstores located in lower middle-class neighborhoods and in newspaper kiosks on the street. Several independent Islamic periodicals emerged in the 1980s as well. Foremost among them was Ch5, the weekly newspaper of the Labour Party, which became increasingly Islamist in tone under the editorial leadership of Adil Hussein. In addition, 3 independent Islamic monthly journals were in circulation: Liwa al-Islam, al-Mukhtar al-Islami, and al-I'tisam, as well as a number of smaller run journals on specialized topics such as Islamic economics. How many Islamic books and journals were published, how many were sold, and what their profits were are hard to determine. Editors of Ch5, as well as most of the Islamic bookstore vendors I interviewed, either claimed they lacked such data or were unwilling to share it. I did, however, learn something about these issues from Abdul Munim Salim, editor-in-chief of Liwa al-Islam. Salim's journal was often described as the successor to Dawah, the popular Brotherhood journal published from 1976 to 1981. According to Salim, the circulation of Liwa al-Islam grew from 35,000 when it was first published in 1987 to about 95,000 in 1991. With just over half of all issues, 50,000 to 55,000, sold in Egypt. Many people can't buy it because they can't afford it, he explained, so it's often Xeroxed and distributed to much larger numbers. The regular purchase of books or journals was indeed beyond the financial means of many lower middle and middle class Egyptians. Relative to the price of other books, however, the price of Islamic publications was conspicuously low. Some Islamic bookstores were able to sell their materials cheaply because they received a subsidy from patrons. Others earned a profit from their sales. For example, LiveReadLearn earned a profit from its sales outside Egypt. Some Islamic bookstores also succeeded commercially. For example, in 1993, the publishing house Dar al-Ittisam sold a poster containing an aerial photograph of a forest in Bavaria in which the trees appeared to spell out a passage from the Quran in Arabic script. At £1 apiece, sales of the poster demonstrating this miracle of nature were reported to have run into the millions. Critics claim that Islamic bookstores' profit margins were widened by the discounts they received from certain printers, suggesting the presence of a network of Islamic suppliers and distributors in the industry. The institution of the Islamic parallel sector were not political in the narrow sense of the term. That is, they did not advocate a particular political agenda or take part in the competition for political power. Moreover, in personal interviews, Egyptians involved in running Islamic welfare societies, kindergartens, and religious classes typically claimed that they had nothing to do with politics. Instead, they saw themselves as educating fellow Muslims on their rights and obligations in Islam, and forging new kinds of communal solidarity based on Islamic principles of charity and self-help. Nevertheless, in the 1980s and early 1990s, the institutions of the parallel sector, Islamic sector, directly contributed to Islamic mobilization in two ways. First, they provided financial and logistical support to Islamic groups with political objectives, including the Islamic Student Associations, the Muslim Brotherhood, and underground militant Islamic groups. Second, they provided the space for a diffuse process of ideological outreach and network building by small clusters of independent activists expanding the base of reformist and militant Islamic political groups alike. In the early 1990s, a spate of attacks on government officials, tourists, and civilians by Islamic militants raised new alarm over the conversion of Islamic institutions into sites of political outreach. As an article published in the semi-official journal Ch5 noted, the deviations of the extremists are many and varied, but at the same time they indicate a new phenomenon, that the extremists are entrenching themselves in the private mosques scattered across the entire country of Egypt. From inside the private mosques, the light of religious extremism beams forth. After the militant groups dominate the mosques, they plan inside them to assassinate prominent people and publish propaganda, execute terrorist activities, and store weapons. The editors of Ch5 stressed that they were not calling for a halt to the building of new mosques, but rather for a change in what was going on inside them, especially now that some of them have become laboratories for the incubation of extremism. Growing anxiety over Islamist outreach on the periphery begs the question, why did the regime tolerate the emergence of the parallel Islamic sector in the first place? It is to this question that we now turn.